Hello, you're tuned to Resilience Radio. I'm your host, Irvin Eisenberg. I'm owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy, and 2 weeks ago we had an episode where we were discussing trans spaces and women's spaces and gendered spaces in general as they pertain to outdoor education and wilderness skills with Murphy Robinson. Today we pick up that conversation with Murphy Robinson, but start discussing mythology, Greek, Norse, and other mythological traditions, and trans role in those mythologies.
So I often think about, especially when we're talking about sort of the huntress archetype and sort of different gods and goddesses, and there are, at least in my exposure to them, you've got the Greek and the Norse gods and such, and there's very clear ideas of what masculinity means. You've got, in Greek, you've got Poseidon, the sea god, you've got Zeus, and you've got Hades, and they might be presented in different ways, but they're very masculine. And then you've got Hera and Diana, and I'm probably mixing Greek and Roman in that. But there seems to be very clear archetypes of male and female, and people don't there. I haven't learned much about any sort of trans archetypes or what. It seems like just very clear ideas, and I was curious if you could speak to both your studies of Norse and Greek and any other European or other archetypes and gender with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been very inspired by mythology throughout my life and my work, and I'm a practicing pagan who engages with deity in a very real way, non-Christian deity typically, and so I've certainly thought about that. And I think the first thing is we need to think about mythology, ancient mythology that comes down to us as filtered through the culture that preserved it. And mostly we really only have stories that were able to get written down. And that's probably a small percentage of the stories that were out there, and mostly the people doing the writing were cisgender men, because that's who was taught to read and write in most cultures in ancient times. Obviously not exclusively, like Sappho was a writer. We have a few rare female writers that have come down to us, but so people write down what they relate to. If I were to be the exclusive person to write down a bunch of mythology and that was like the only document that survived 2,000 years from now or something, people would be like, wow, that culture that they were living in was super queer. but that would just be because I was the one writing it down, and I would be more interested in the queer stuff. So I always keep in mind that we're working with fragments, and that what was erased had to do with the values of the society. And but also some things are like preserved in mythology that weren't even really present in that culture. Like, most women in ancient Greek society were basically chattel. Once you were married, you were your husband's property, and you had very, limited ability to partake in different activities and things like that. And many people in these societies were like outright slaves or indentured servants of different kinds. So yeah, just keeping in mind that like the ruling class, the educated class, were the people writing these things down. And for Norse mythology, that it was also like the Christians were writing these things down. So Norse mythology was recorded by Christian monks, because there was not a tradition of narrative writing before Christians brought the Latin alphabet with them and Latin language with them. There was runic writing, but it was really more of a magical alphabet. Like you could inscribe a name or write a spell, or like make a rune stone that said like, so and so claimed this land for his family or something like that. But it wasn't like stories that were being written down usually. So there you've got both, educated people and Christian religious people writing things down. Whereas in the Greek tradition, we have actual pagans writing it down. In the Celtic tradition, we also have, again, Christians are writing everything down. So just keeping in mind the filters and what would have been filtered out. Like in ancient Ireland, I've heard, haven't studied this myself, but I've heard that there were basically marriage laws for same-sex couples. Like they were like in the old pre-Christian codes there, or even like early Christian codes there, because it was kind of this wild west of Christianity where people didn't follow the rules and had their own culture around it. And you would never know that from talking to Irish Catholic priests today about what a proper version of marriage is in Ireland or something like that. But in the ancient times, there maybe was a lot more flexibility. And there are some bits of gender fluidity and gender transition that do come down to us in the myths, despite all of this filtration that happened in the writing down period. And the one that I've studied the most deeply is Loki in the Norse pantheon. Loki transforms gender presentation and changes medical gender a couple times in the myths that we have of him, and I'm sure there's many myths we don't have of him, or perhaps it would be more proper to call Loki them, I'm not sure. But there's a story where the gods are having this giant build a wall for their fortress, and they've struck a deal that he has to finish it by a certain date or he doesn't get paid for it. And he has this really strong stallion that helps him finish the wall in record time. The guys are like, oh my gosh, he's going to finish it by the deadline and we're going to have to pay him. And we actually didn't want to pay him. I think they were going to have to pay him. The goddess Freya's hand in marriage or something major. So they're trying to get out of the contract, basically. And the way that they solve it is that Loki transforms himself into a mare, into a female horse, and lures the giant stallion away with Loki's sexual charms as a mare. And so the giant is not able to finish the wall in time, and the gods don't have to pay him Freya's hand in marriage. And then at the end of the story, the little after note is, and X number of months later, Loki gave birth to a foal. So, Loki not only presented as female in that moment, Loki was impregnated and bore a horse child. And that foal is Odin's 8-legged steed. It's the greatest of all the horses. Whereas Loki's also considered, portrayed as male in many different instances, and as having slept with people and fathered children as well. So yeah, Loki is both a father and a mother, which is something that some trans people can really relate to. And Loki is often presented in this trickster devil aspect in the Christian monk writings about him. And I sometimes wonder how much of that is trying to demonize his gender fluidity and his freedom with gender, and the way that he changes gender presentations and sort of gendered powers so easily, and that is threatening to the Christian order of the time. And there are other examples in other mythologies around the world. That's the one that I have the most fluency off the top of my head in. And there are also just a lot of butch goddesses. They're Skathi, the hunting goddess of the Norse pantheon, and to some degree I would say Artemis and the Greeks are these very athletic, very bold, firm boundaries, skilled in weapons, good in war, intimidating warriors. They're presenting in these ways that we might today call butch. And we should also keep in mind that gender transition, we have a lot of medical options right now that are very rare in history, and to expect to find a god who's had top surgery or something like that, that's pretty anachronistic. There certainly were breast removal surgeries that happened for various reasons in ancient times, but they were much more of a threat to your life and a much bigger risk to take on before we had modern surgical procedures that keep you safe from infection and stuff like that. So, and certainly hormone therapy is a very recent thing. So I think that we can look at the ways that gods transgress gendered behavior as the place where we're going to find the most evidence for transgender existence in deity and myth that can offer us an archetype that is inspiring for our own explorations and gender journeys.
Mm-hmm. I think to some of in a little bit of my Buddhist studies and just and looking at different imagery from different Asian Sanskrit and Buddhist Hindu and such, that there's a lot of portrayal of multiple arms, multiple sex organs sometimes. There is more representation in I wouldn't say fluid, but a diverse presentation. And
totally.
And I guess that hasn't it's had more time to develop without the filtration of Christianity. And I'm curious, I don't know enough about who was doing the writing down for these Sanskrit documents, and some of them were images anyway, so that it was harder to change over time. But it's interesting to think that maybe if we went back, that we would have equivalents to that in European mythology, where yeah.
I think one place where we can see a less, or like a good documentation of gender diversity that's untainted by like Western patriarchy, as in the record of Native American cultures here in, indigenous cultures to Turtle Island here in North America. There are so many different gender archetypes in the different peoples that were here before colonization and are still here. And much of that was stamped out with great intention by the colonizers. When colonizers came in and started up these schools for indigenous children and things like that, or just like came in and were doing the initial sort of slaughtering that was happening. Certainly anyone who didn't fit the gender binary was going to seem super threatening and abnormal to them and disturbing to them, and they were going to do away with that person very quickly. So we know, many of these tribes have a cultural memory of the different archetypes of, the Winkte or the Berdash, kind of like the trans woman type role in society, or there's also trans masculine roles in the society. I've heard of tribes where, like, if a girl dreamed of bows and arrows and weapons before she got her period, she was then raised as a boy. That was considered like the sign that she was supposed to be a hunter and a warrior, and not like a mother and a wife. And there, many of these peoples had like very specific roles, like that, if they have what we would now consider maybe like a gay couple in tribal society, like their role might be to parent the orphans, in a culture whose people were perhaps dying younger and had less predictable lifespans. They would probably be more orphans, especially while they're like at war with the violent colonizers. And these couples that maybe couldn't have biological children of their own without modern medicine were still able to fulfill a really important role in society and holding together the fabric of everything. And there's also definitely like evidence of specific spiritual roles for transgender people in pre-colonization cultures the world over, that has always been considered it's a kind of edge walking that brings a certain amount of insight and allows people to cross that boundary between the material and the spirit realm with greater fluency, because they're also crossing this boundary between genders, and there's just a practice in like moving across boundaries and states. That's a very common cultural archetype that you find in like the anthropological record. So yeah, moving on from gods and goddesses, but into actual like people and their lived experience, we have very many different roles acknowledged and honored in different cultures for trans people. We just gotta work out a way to have some of that acceptance in our current culture. We're doing pretty good in Vermont, but nationally there's a lot of concerns.
Well, thank you again for coming on, and it's really been great having these conversations with you. I feel like I learned so much about culture and history and everything.
Yeah, thanks, Irvin. Always fun to talk.
Thank you for listening to Resilience Radio. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, you can subscribe in the podcatcher of your choice and get a new episode every week. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. Thank you for listening. Take care.